Hey everybody, it's hwsteele. Today is Tuesday, September 10th, 2024, and in this video I want to talk to you a little bit about some things that happen in the zodiac from our point of view, geocentrically, that always happen the same way. Now here's the thing, if you want to learn how to forecast the markets, stock market, commodities market, whichever market you're looking at, and you want to learn how to do it like W.D. Gann or George Bayer, people of that nature, they were using the planets to help them forecast. So if you want to forecast like they were, you will have to start using the planets. Now, the way they used the planets was between astrology and astronomy, and they were a lot closer to the astrology side of things than the straight up astronomy side of things. Now, there's a couple of things that, well, it helps you to understand because they didn't use straight up astrology. They inserted some pretty significant mathematics, not necessarily complex mathematics, but they used a lot of mathematics in their methodologies to forecast the markets that isn't in normal astrology. But there's a couple of things I want to point out here that if you look at the planets in the way that I'm going to show you in this video, it can help you think more along the lines of the way that people like W.D. Gann and George Bayer were thinking. So the first thing I want to look at is, this is a zodiac represented in Astrolog 7.6. I have it set to geocentric, which means as viewed from the Earth. And I just have the four fast planets in quote here, the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and Mars right here. We're just going to use those to look at so the screen's not so cluttered with a bunch of different glyphs for different planets. First thing I want to look at is this right here is showing us the position of the planets. Like for instance, the Sun is in the first degree of Pisces right here. Mercury is in the 27th degree of Aquarius, Venus is in the 19th degree of Capricorn, and Mars is in the very first degree of Virgo right here. But what will happen is, as these planets move through the different signs of the zodiac, it's going to count over from 0 all the way up to the 30th degree of the sign of the zodiac that it's in. So it'll go from 0 to 30, 0 to 30, 0 to 30 over and over again. And that's typically how you'll see the planets represented in astrology. Well, folks like Gann and Bayer, if we go to display settings and click on 360 degrees here, while they did look at the position of the planets inside of each sign, they also paid very close attention to the number of degree in longitude the planet was around the entirety of the zodiac. In other words, instead of counting 30 degrees and 30 degrees and 30 degrees, they would just count starting right here, count 30, 60, 90, 120, and keep counting like that until they got to 360, and then they would start counting over again. So this is one of the things you're going to want to do, is look at the zodiac as a whole and pay attention to the number of degree the planet is in the zodiac. Now, if you've watched very many of my videos that I've done previously on this channel, you see that I pretty much always have astrologs set up like this, so you're probably pretty familiar with that. Another thing I want to point out to you is that when looking geocentrically, we'll see retrograde motion. And if we look here, there we go, we can see that in the planet, or in the, not the planet, the program astrolog right here, that we can look at this line that's right by the glyph for the Sun, and we see that it's bright white. That means it's in direct motion. If we look at Mercury right here, we see that same line is grayed out. That means it's retrograde motion. If we look at Venus, it's direct because it's a bright white. Mars over here is in retrograde because it's grayed out. And if we look over here, we can see that there's an R next to the planet and its longitude there that denotes the retrograde motion. So the thing is, retrograde motion happens with these planets, and it always happens when the planet is on the opposite side of the zodiac from the Sun. First off, you have to know and understand that retrograde motion only happens when you're looking at things geocentrically. And for every planet that is physically outside of Earth's orbit in the solar system, which is Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, you will always have retrograde motion on the other side of the zodiac from the sun. The only exceptions are Mercury and Venus, and that's because these two planets are between the Earth and the sun, so we're always going to see them close to the sun. They'll never get more than, Mercury will never be more than 30 degrees away from the sun, a little less than that actually, and Venus will never be more than about 50 degrees away from the sun. So as a result of that, when they go retrograde motion, when they go into retrograde motion, they'll be close to the sun, relatively speaking. But all of the other planets, starting with Mars all the way out to Pluto, will always be retrograde on the other side of the solar system than the sun. And what that means is, without exception, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto will always be retrograde when they're in opposition to the sun. Now, if we look at this number, we see that this is the longitude of the planets in the zodiac. If we look at this number, this is the latitude. That's the number of degrees above or below the plane that is created by the sun and the earth. So if we consider the sun and the earth on the same level plane constantly, the other planets are a number of degrees above or below that relative to the earth and the sun. We see that the sun geocentrically is always going to be at 0 degrees latitude. No matter if we go forward in time, we see that it stays at 0 degrees. It might be like 1/1000th of a degree off every once in a while. And that's really just the calculations of the program, because the sun does not change. And we'll see that the other planets, here we have Mercury, Venus, and Mars again. Right here, their latitude is above. So that means the planets are above the Earth and the sun. And then we can see them start to go negative latitude there. Okay. So knowing that the other planets besides the Earth and the sun will move above or below the Earth's orbit, we get our latitude for the planets from that happening. If we go to settings here in Astrolog and calculation settings, we can turn on the equatorial settings. And what that does is it looks at the other planets relative to the equator of the Earth. And as a result of the Earth being tilted about 23.4 degrees or so, we're going to get what's called declination. So the declination is a combination of the latitude of the planet and the Earth's 23.4 degree tilt. So that means that the majority of the number we see as the declination is always going to be from the tilt of the Earth. Now, if we look at the sun's at minimum declination at the winter solstice. It's at maximum declination at the summer solstice, meaning it's the highest in the sky as viewed on Earth. It's the lowest in the sky here, and it's in the middle of that range right here on the equinoxes, spring equinox, fall equinox. And since the declination number, the majority of it comes from the tilt of the Earth, that means all of the other planets are going to be at maximum declination and minimum declination right around these points of the zodiac. They're going to be at 0 degrees declination right around these points. Now, because it's not just the tilt of the Earth that's being taken into account for the planet's declination, it's also their latitude, it won't always be exactly on the same lines that the sun experiences minimum, maximum, and 0 degrees declination, but it's always going to be very close. So, for instance, if we look at the planets here, all the planets are very close to this 270th degree of the zodiac, which is the winter solstice point. We can watch the sun, and the sun's declination as it gets closer to that point gets lower and lower, and then as it moves away from that point it gets higher and higher. Well, so do all of the other planets right there. So as the planets get closer to what we consider the 0 degree of the zodiac, or the start of the zodiac, or the spring equinox, we'll see that the planets' declinations are going to increase. We see Mercury is the lowest declination here at minus 11.6 degrees. but it's the furthest one away from this equinox point and closest to this minimum declination point right there. So as Mercury moves past that 0 point, we see that it's going to move to 0 declination. And again, it doesn't happen at exactly the same spot right here. It happens very, very close to it. So if you're someone who is trying to learn to pay attention to the declination of the planets, what you're really, really paying attention to is these 4 spots in the zodiac. Because if you're looking for a planet to be at maximum declination or minimum declination or 0 degrees declination, that only ever happens at these 4 points in the zodiac. So that's something to keep in mind while you're doing your studies. One last thing I want to talk about is the fact that if we go back to calculation settings and turn off the equatorial so that we can get the planet's latitude here, or the planet's how high above the Sun-Earth plane or how far below the Sun-Earth plane it is, we can get that number from this latitude right here. If we look at that, let's look at Mars right here. You see Mars is a little bit negative right here, and as we move forward, Mars gets closer and closer to 0 degrees latitude. Well, right here, I'm going to turn off all the other, so we can just use Mars to see that better. Right here, Mars moves from southern latitude to northern latitude. So this point right here is Mars's north node point. Just like the moon, you know, you've heard of the lunar north node and the lunar south node. This point right here at about 63 degrees is Mars's north node point. And if we go forward in time, see Mars go retrograde, and almost 2 years later we can watch Mars reach its north node again, and we see that it is at about 45, 46 degrees right here where Mars hits its north node. Mars's north node moves just like the lunar north node moves, but it's moving at a faster rate. If we look at the other planets like Jupiter or Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, they all have north and south nodes also, and those nodes, they move less than Mars's node. They move less than Mercury and Venus. Their nodes move all over the place quite a bit. But the point I wanted to make to you is the fact that all of the planets, not just the moon, have north and south nodes. And those are something that you may want to put some effort into researching over time. So anyway, video is already getting pretty long, so I want to go ahead and end it here. But if you're wanting to look at the planets to try and figure out how folks like W.D. Gann and George Bayer were making forecasts, you have to look past standard astrology and start noticing things like the 3 things that I showed in this video. So anyway, until next time, this is hwsteele, and I'll talk to you later.